All right, here's the story. One of the most influential rabbis in the 20th century, Abraham Joshua Heschel, once said of the mission of our lives that our task is to sanctify the secular and to humanize the sacred. To humanize the sacred and to sanctify the secular. Now, what I really love about this quote is that it sort of obliterates the mutual exclusivity that we're used to between the sacred and the secular. I mean, we live in a culture where we've got separation between church and state. We have even some conflicts between science and religion. We're really used to this separation, and the truth is there's nothing really wrong with this little separation. In fact, we should probably be wary of anything that purports to integrate the two, especially in an inappropriate way. But I actually think that basically no matter where we are on the spectrum of sacred, secular living in terms of how we define ourselves, there's something that we all miss out on when we keep the sacred and the secular so far apart from each other that they cease to communicate with each other, or if they even fall into conflict sometimes. There's something about that we can all relate to, some way that the sacred and the secular don't find harmony in our lives, and too often in our communities and our society at large, for sure. So the question is, what does this have to do with all of us? I think that basically, like I said, no matter what we believe, no matter what we do or don't believe, frankly, it's critical that we have these experiences of recognition of sanctity in life. And I think everyone knows, again, no matter what you believe or don't believe, that you've had a moment like this maybe, where all of a sudden you recognize something that could have hit you at any moment because it's really true all the time. That somehow every single moment in the history of the universe has led up to this one right now. And that just by virtue of being alive, we're on the cutting edge of something altogether extraordinary and unprecedented. But the question becomes, how do we bring this into our lives in a less random, less spontaneous way? Because it tends to dawn on us in moments of, seeing a beautiful vista or a landscape somewhere, maybe hearing a voice of an old friend, or seeing a gesture of generosity, or even in something tragic and terrifying. But if we could make this more regular in our lives, we could do something to give us this heightened awareness when sanctity comes into our lives and just comes into the forefront of our consciousness. Like Rabbi Heschel's quote, we see that something actually amazing can happen when the two are allowed to reflect off of one another. And again, I'm not talking about integration here, but I think that recognizing a certain level of interrelationship is important. So I actually want to try an experiment with everyone here tonight. It won't take long, I promise. And I know, again, like I said, it's a little risky to mix the sacred and the secular if you're, but I actually really believe in the spiritual potential of spaces like this. So I want to give it a try. What do you think? Yeah. All right. I'm going to count to 3 and we'll see what happens, all right? Let's all. 1, 2, 3. Climate change. Right? Now, for a lot of you, what happened was I just turned into, even for just a second, like a telemarketer, right? You freaked out a little bit that I mentioned climate change. And I am actually not much of an expert on it. I'm not really much of an activist either. In fact, I think they're probably the people that are the most surprised that I'm talking about it are people who actually know me. But I really like climate change as an example for this conversation about, what could it possibly have to do with this question of how we establish a more healthy relationship between the sacred and the secular in our lives. I really like it as an example actually because of that reaction. Because we tend to view it a little bit like a religion, right? There's some tripwire that goes off in our brains, especially when someone mentions it in public, that just causes all this skepticism all of a sudden to come out of nowhere. And what's really funny about this, obviously, is that climate change is not a religion. It's science, right? And that same part of our brains that makes us really, skeptical all of a sudden, it's that same part that actually allows us to trust the 97% of climatologists who say this problem is real. It's happening right here on Earth right now. It affects all of us, and we all can do something actually about it potentially. So the question becomes, what's really interesting about this is that it's not just that climate change makes us feel this way, right? The fact is we all, in some ways, I'm sure, vast majority of us, we actually do believe in climate change, and we might even want to do something about it, or at least know that we should, but we don't want to be converted to it. And my fundamental claim here tonight is that what's true about climate change is also true about a lot of these questions that come up when we talk about bringing sanctity into our lives. Right? In the same way that we want to do right by our planet, we also want to do right by the people who we love. We want to live good lives. And in those moments when we feel close to sanctity, when a sense of the sacred becomes a little more relatable and the secular or mundane becomes a little more meaningful, it's in those moments that are just like these random bolts of lightning that we all sometimes get when we realize that climate change is actually happening and it's this vastly overwhelming reality. It's that same feeling, and it causes this feeling of sort of almost a memory, of a remembrance of something that's always true about how we want to live our lives, that we want to live with integrity. We want to leave this earth knowing that we didn't take stuff for granted too much, that we trusted in love. Right? And there's something about that experience, again, that we might even know. We might even know that there's ancient wisdom out there associated with traditions both secular and sacred, religious and philosophical, that could point us to really interesting ways to embrace a better life. But just like in talking about taking climate change seriously, we just really don't want to be converted to it. And this is where it gets really interesting, because it turns out that there's a lot of things about climate change that actually raise in our consciousness pieces of this conversation about how to live a good life that are integral to a lot of our best wisdom traditions that have a lot to say about it, like how we want to be remembered. What are our responsibilities to past and future generations? What's our relationship to nature, especially as an intelligent part of it? What about that, ultimately universal sense of shared destiny and sense of shared bond that we have with all of humanity? So if our goal here is to find ways of bringing the sacred into our lives, no matter how secular we may be, by the way, and also to bring that sense of sanctity down to earth, to put it to work here in the world as it is, and if climate change seems to be this sort of secular prism for access to all these ancient focal points for how to live a good life, then our generation, we have an incredible opportunity here, because we could potentially live with that sense of sanctity and save the planet in the process. I mean, in other words, we've got this situation where climate change is inspiring us to live better lives if we're really thinking about it, and walking in those ways, doing all those things, have the potential, I think, also to be the seeds of what's really necessary to confront the problem of the climate crisis. But two really important points about this. First of all, none of this requires extremism. As much as climate change really calls on us to make some pretty radical changes in our lives, and it probably will change all of our lives, whether we do something or not. That's a choice. And in our society, the fact is that a lot of the conversations that happen in the ancient wisdom traditions that I've been talking about, a lot of the best that human civilization has produced in terms of systems of thought and theology, as far as they're concerned about living a better life, yes, they want to remind us of what's important, and they want to stir our consciousness out of complacency. They want to wake us up and make us more alert to the moment right in front of us. But they're also pretty clear that living a good life is not really a matter of some overnight revelation or revolution of consciousness, usually. Most times it's actually this sort of reasonable effort put in by pretty moderate people to take a leap of faith and embrace uncertainty and show up and keep showing up day after day, building practices for better living. So it may not be easy, but it doesn't have to be extreme. And even if the change that we're pursuing is really fundamental, it doesn't require us to become fundamentalist about anything. And on this last point, I'll just close by saying, I think if we're really serious about having that feeling, of feeling that connection to the sacred spiritual gravity of just the sheer existence of being alive, no matter how we choose to label it or interpret it, if we're really after that feeling, we're going to have to set up ways to remind ourselves and each other to stay alert, to appreciate what we have before it's gone. And that's just as true about a good life as it is about keeping a good planet, right? I mean, don't it always seem to go that you don't know what you got till it's gone? That is an environmentalism song, right? But in a larger sense, it makes sense that all of these tried and true methods that have come out of all types of human civilizations from Mount Sinai to Machiavelli to mindfulness meditation, it makes sense that they focus on keeping us alert, keeping us on our toes as a means to live a good life. Because as it turns out, life ends, and we don't want to miss it. Right? We don't want to miss it. And if we're really clear about the reality of death and climate change and things that we don't really want to think about that make us really uncomfortable and that are challenging and troubling in all sorts of ways, it pays to acknowledge that we do have evolutionarily developed capacities to deal with stuff like that by pushing it to the realms of the margins of our consciousness, by even just kind of letting it out of our attention pretty naturally, glossing over a lot of life. And sometimes that capacity can be really important. In fact, in some cases, it's downright necessary. But it's also sort of the opposite of what we've been talking about. And in fact, I think I would argue that reckoning honestly with mortality is one of the core insights about living a good life that climate change brings to life. But with one important caveat, which is that even though no human being has really escaped death, the planet need not be mortal in that sense. Life on Earth can continue. So if we take our cues from climate change and talking about it and taking it seriously, it opens up this possibility of getting one last kernel that I think is pretty important from these ancient wisdom traditions that I keep talking about. And that is what they have to say about immortality. If we're really serious about living these more meaningful lives and bringing that sense of the sacred down to earth, then a big piece of that work is going to be recognizing that the best bet that a lot of these traditions focus on when it comes to somehow achieving some measure of immortality and transcending death in some way, it really comes down most usually to honoring one's ancestors and safeguarding the future for one's descendants. So let's save the planet. It might make us better people, and I think it could also give us that sense that we've lived well. Thank you.